Well, hello everyone. What I wanted to do is go over part of this Chapter 5 loop stuff to make sure that you're comfortable with it, because a few people have come up to me and said they're concerned about this portion of the midterm, but they should not be. So, going to the slides, one of the main things I want to hit on is what does every loop need? And if you know what every loop needs, then you can make sure you write that when you create your loop. And what does every loop need? It needs a loop control variable, needs to test whether you do the loop by testing a loop control variable. Then after you do whatever code you have in there in your statements, you're going to increment the loop control variable. So that's basically every loop needs that. And we're going to write the same program using a while loop. Then we're going to do a do while loop, and the main difference with a do while loop is you run through at least once, and that is going to make a difference on how I write this program. And then finally, a for loop, which makes our life a little easier because the loop control variable, the testing, and the incrementation are all on the same line. So I'm going to go back here to the slide that says, hey, I want to print the sum of squares of all odd numbers between 0 and 100. And the code that's on the slide is basically what I'm going to replicate in the editor, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to test it. But I wanted to do it basically from scratch and walk through each line of the code, and I'm going to start that with some pseudocode. So very first things first, I have a simple HTML that just points to a JavaScript so I can do some alert boxes for my loops. Okay, so in my JavaScript, there you go, I want to write my pseudocode. So what is that going to look like? Well, the very first program I want to write, I'm going to write it as a while loop. So I'm going to write a while loop, and it does what we want it to do, print the sum of squares of all odd numbers between 0 and 100. And what you're going to find is this pseudocode that I write here for this while loop is going to be the same exact pseudocode I write for the do while and the for, because they do the same things, just with slightly different syntax. So when in this particular problem, we have to declare our loop control variable, right? So our loop control variable in this case, once I learn how to type, let's just set it to something simple like x. So declare a loop control variable, we're calling it x, and we're going to set it initially to 0. Why? Because that's what the problem tells us that we're supposed to do. We're supposed to start with 0 and go to 100. Then we also need to declare a variable, we'll call it int squares, which is the sum of squares. And before we run the loop, well, we haven't done anything yet, so we should probably set that value equal to 0. Now, later on when I do the do while and the for loop, I don't have to redeclare these variables, but if I use the same variables, I'm going to have to reset them. Now, I'm going to go through my loop now and say, okay, I want to write a loop, and what is that loop going to do? That loop validates whether my loop control variable is still less than or equal to 100, because I want to go from 0 to 100. And then if it is, I'm going to want to test whether that current value of x, in this particular case, is an odd number. And how do we do that? Well, we're going to use the modulus function, of course.
Well, that beeping noise you heard was the fire alarm because someone burned a cookie. Anyway, getting back to our program, we're going to use the modulus function, and when you're checking to see if something is even, you're going to do a mod, and you're going to divide by 2. If it's equal to 0 or equivalent to 0, it would be even. If it's equivalent to 1, it would be odd. So we're going to use that basic functionality of the modulus function to test for even or odd. And again, you could easily do this with different types of numbers. So if something is odd, where the remainder is a 1, meaning it's not an even number, then we're going to add the current value of x times x to the int squares. And that'll end our decision. So basically every time we go through the loop, we test to see if x is odd or even. If it's odd, we add it to the squares, and then we're done. Now, staying inside our loop, we have our loop control variable, we tested on it, we did our statement, and then we have to remember to increment x by 1. That's the end of our while loop. And then lastly, so we have our input, which we defined as x initially as our input. We have our processing, which is the loop, and then we do our output. We'll just do some kind of output, an alert statement, something like that. We're actually going to do 3 alert statements because we're going to do 3 loops in a row, and we're going to compare the output. So that's the pseudocode that effectively works for every one of these loops. So now I'm going to go ahead and code it using the pseudocode. So starting at the top line of the pseudocode, declaring x equal to 0, declare int squares equals to 0. And remember, you're declaring the variable up front. You don't have to declare it again. You can change its value without declaring it later. Now in your loop control variable, you're testing it with as long as you are x less than or equal to 100, you're going to go ahead and run your statement of your loop. And in your statement, you're going to test if x mod 2 is equivalent to 1. And we use 3 equal signs because that means we're testing both sides to make sure the value is the same and it's the same type. And if it's true, then we take int squares and we add x times x to it, and x is the current value of the iteration of the loop that we're currently in. And you have to forgive my typos and everything like that because I'm bad with that. Now, could I also do int squares x times x equals int squares? And the answer is no, because what happens when you would do that? You would get int squares times x, and we don't want to do that. So I just bring that up. That's why you have to be careful with the whole operator equals thing, because yes, you can do it. You just have to make sure you understand what you're doing in this. And so the question in this case is, can we write it that way? The answer is no. If you were adding it, yeah, sure, you could do that, but we're not going to do that. So again, we've added our x times x, the square, to int squares, and then we increment our loop control variable. Now we have all of our features. X is our loop control variable, which we defined. We test it, x less than or equal 100 to continue the loop, and we incremented inside the loop to test that again to see if we are going to continue on running the loop. And then a simple alert statement, sum of all odd numbers from 0 to 100 are, and then you just go ahead and concatenate with, and concatenate that with int squares, and save our code, go to HTML, and go ahead and run our program, see what happens. So I'm going to preview in the browser. Here we go. Okay, the output is whatever that number is right there. We hit OK. Now we're supposed to do test cases, right? Well, we're just doing an example of loops. So in this case, I don't have test cases, but what you could do is go back to your JavaScript, and instead of going x all the way up to 100, you could change that to maybe 10. But even that's kind of hard because now you're going to have 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, so maybe you go 5. And you go ahead and 5, I think the sum of squares should be around 35 if I'm correct. Oh, make sure you actually do the preview from the HTML, not the JavaScript. And hey, how about that? It's 35. And you could test that. You could build that test case in, but again, for this program, we're not worried about it. Now, let's go back to our JavaScript, and we just did the while loop. Let's do the do loop, and this is going to be effectively the exact same pseudocode, except I'm going to use a do loop instead of a while loop. And I'm going to go fix that x was 100. Go ahead and paste it in, and I'm just going to change my pseudocode. Instead of writing a while loop, I'm going to put in here using a while loop in the above alert statement, just so I can see what parts of the code are running. And then in my pseudocode, instead of writing a while loop, I'm going to go write a do loop. And I can also put down in the pseudocode, instead of end while, I could just change that to end loop, which is fine because, again, a while, a do while, and a for loop can all kind of be used equally, although there are some minor things you have to be careful of, and the do loop is that one you have to be careful. Now, do I start out with, again, declaring my loop control variable with var x and var int squares? Well, remember, we already have a value for x at this point. X is going to be 101, and int squares is going to be that large number, so we just want to reset them. We don't have to redeclare them. If we wanted to, we could go var y and something else for int squares, but let's just stick with x and int squares. Now we go into our loop. We start our do loop with the word do and not d0. I have a typing issue going on right here. And go straight into the source code, or the code where I'm testing whether x is an even or odd number the same way I did it in the while loop. And I get the same exact answer. If it is odd, I am going to add to int squares its current value plus x times x, or x squared. Again, I have typing errors. I have a problem. And don't forget to increment your x. Right now, at this point, you go to your while, and you have to ask yourself the question, do I also go x less than or equal to 100? And the answer is yes. You're supposed to be x is less than or equal to 100. I'm just going to do it wrong here, x less than 100. It won't matter in this problem because when you get to x is 100, 100 is not an odd number. It won't actually change your int squares. However, if we were doing sum of squares up to 100, we would have had a problem. I just bring this up and I'm showing this to you because if you think about it, and I won't discuss it here, if I had the x plus plus above the if statement, then the while x is less than 100 would actually be the appropriate statement. Think about that. Not testable right now. We'll cover it after the exam. But it should be while x is less than or equal to 100. And moving on, put the alert statement in here and go ahead and save it. It's for the do loop. Go back to HTML and preview it. And I hit it, and guess what? Got the exact same value, which I expected. Even though I have that while loop decision is incorrect in this case, it doesn't matter because the last number, which is being skipped, I'm not going up to 100, is an even number. It won't matter. Now, final loop is a while loop. I'm sorry, it's a for loop, excuse me. And for loops make our life a little easier because inside the for loop, we put our actual loop control variable initialization, as well as our increment and our test. So we start that out with the word for. Now, typically, if I hadn't already defined x, I would go var x equals, but since I'm using a variable that's already been declared, I'm going to use x equals 0. I'm going to do it properly here, x less than or equal to 100, and then increment x plus plus. I use the exact same if statement. If whatever the value of x is, mod 2 is equivalent to 1, which means the remainder is 1, it has to be odd. And if that's true, what am I going to do? I'm going to add x times x, so x squared to int sum. So that's int square, excuse me. So that's kind of standard. And again, as in all the previous loops, I have a loop control variable x. I test that loop control variable as x is less than or equal to 100, and then I alter the loop control variable. In this case, I'm incrementing up to 1 at a time until I get to the point where I run out of the loop because x is greater than 100. So once x gets to 101, it won't run this loop anymore. Don't forget we have to do an alert statement for output because our incrementing is inside of the for statement, that x plus plus at the end of the for statement. Go ahead and change our alert statement to say that we're using a for loop and go ahead and save it. Go back and test our HTML and preview in the browser. And when you do that, you'll notice that we get 3 alert statements and all 3 alert statements are correct. So there you go. That's what we have for explaining these basic loops. So it's a loop with an if decision nested below it. Please understand this for the exam. Aloha.